welcome to the Enlightened Awakening Podcast,
a place of honest and authentic conversations.
I'm your host, Timmy.
And I'm Uriel.
And today we've actually got a very special guest that's going to be joining us. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Well, hi, Timmy, and hi, Uriel. My name is Christine, and I'm very honored, and thank you for having me on the podcast. First of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
Very proud of you both. And yeah, honored to be your first guest.
Welcome.
And excited.
Yeah, this is a monumental episode having our first guest, and it's going to be an interesting conversation for you guys. And Christine is somebody that Uriel and I have got to know through our work in the field of mental health. And so we all have that shared passion for wanting to understand the mind a little bit better. And so that's definitely going to come through in our conversation today. And so we're going to be diving into a book that Christine actually recommended to us called A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle. And this book, honestly, for me, is likely not one I would have read if it wasn't for Christine's recommendations. Obviously, anytime somebody like Christine is going to come with a book recommendation, there's a lot to that. And so I wanted to dive in and kind of see what it was about, and I was not disappointed. Uriel, I'm sure it was the same for you, eh?
Yeah, I'm of the opinion that I'm always afraid of taking advice from people. Not that I don't trust others, but I'm very wary that advice can be detrimental to you as well. So following the wrong advice can actually lead you to the wrong path. But I was incredibly pleasantly surprised. Not that I had any doubts about you, Christine. The book is excellent.
We're going to do something a little bit interesting to start with. We have this game called Close, Closer, Closest. And I don't know if any of you guys have heard of it, but it's a packet of 3 different sets of cards that ask a different level or questions that are at different intimacy levels, depending on what the players are comfortable with. And so we're actually going to start off with this kind of like an icebreaker activity so you guys can get to know Christine, but also Uriel and I a little bit more. And so, Christine, for the first card, are you going close? Are you going closer? Or are you going closest?
Oh, well, since we are doing 2 questions, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Dive right in.
And let's start with the middle one. What is it? Closer.
Yeah, go ahead and draw a card and tell us what the question is.
You guys are going to be answering too, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So the question is, are you living the life of your dreams? Okay.
Ladies first.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thanks for letting me start. No pressure. In this moment, I would say probably not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do I know what that life looks like? I do not. So, but I don't know. I would say no.
Yeah.
To keep it simple.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Uriel, go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think I am either. Although I don't believe I actually have an idea of what my dream life would look like quite yet. I think I'm still trying to figure out whatever that might be.
For myself, I'm also going to say no, but I would say that I have a clearer picture of what that life ultimately looks like than I ever have. And it's a huge blessing to be able to create spaces for conversations like this, because I think that that's what helps us move closer, right? It's like iron sharpens iron. And as we discuss these different ideas, then for those of us maybe who aren't quite as clear on what that might look like, I think we can gradually get closer. So I'm looking forward to this for that reason. All right, Christine, card number 2. What are you thinking? Oh, closest.
All right, let's do closest. Oh, this is scary. Okay. Oh, what is the nicest thing anyone has done for you? Oh, geez. Can I not go first?
Sure, we'll go Timmy first, and
Okay.
you can end.
I think for myself, it's tricky to pin down one individual thing, but the things that I find to be the most kind are things that people do that have absolutely no benefit to them, that it's very clear that the only reason they did that is because they genuinely wanted to show you kindness. And so I'd have to think longer to say definitively if this was the nicest thing, but something for me is just the little things. And so there was this one nurse that works in one of the areas that I work in, that one day before I got a car, he had left already and came back afterwards and said, you know what, I forgot to ask you if you actually needed a ride today. And for me, it just blew my mind, because there were other people that, I live pretty close to the hospital, and people who sometimes would give me rides, but on this cold, frigid winter night, nobody offered. And of course, I wasn't entitled to that, right? But to me, that just really stood out to me because I'm like, this guy was already gone. He could have been halfway home by now before he came back, right? And so that to me will always be something that stood out, especially because this particular individual is somebody who I would say is not someone that most people get along very well with. But it just really showed me that there was that piece of, or that gold, I would say, that golden kind of consideration that is pretty rare in this day and age. So that really stands out to me.
I don't think I can pinpoint it to one thing either. I'm just going to say like one of the nicest things that people do for me is just genuine generosity. I don't know, it just touches my heart in a different type of way when people are very generous and have genuine desires to just be generous with you, whether it is emotionally, sometimes economically, or sometimes even just a hug or a smile goes a long way. And when people extend that level of empathy and kindness to others, it just fills me with joy.
I would say I would have to agree when someone does something that's very selfless and very thoughtful. A couple things I would say, one of my best friends, when I was going through a tough time, every single day without fail, she would call me to check in. And no matter what she was going through, she showed up for me every single day for quite a while. And I felt really honored to have a friend like that in my life. Something else I would say too is, at work, like a coworker will if a coworker comes up and says, I just want you to know that you did a really great job when dealing with the situation. It's not necessary for someone to come and give you like a pat on the back, but it really goes a long way.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing I saw a common thread where it's really the little things. It's not those grandiose gestures, right, that people do that you're like, oh, I'm going to remember that forever. Oftentimes the intricacy of acts like that is just how small they are and how easy they are to do, but also how easy they are not to do.
And it's a genuine reminder of the impact that you're having on the world, however big or small.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be, like you said, a grand gesture. And we all are capable of doing it for other people. So
that's right.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Okay. So diving into the book now, Christine, I want you to share a little bit with Euro and I about what it was that stood out to you in this book that you're like, I need to recommend this to these guys.
Yeah. We really just want to know, like, how did you hear about this book first?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I don't actually remember when I heard about the book. I do remember years and years ago picking this book up and reading through it. And, something that Eckhart Tolle mentioned in one of his podcasts was that this book will resonate with you when you are ready to hear it. It's pretty loaded. There's a lot of information. It's really deep content. And I think if you're not at the place where you're ready and open to take it in, it's not going to resonate with you. So I did read it once when I was super young, I think, and it just hadn't, it didn't resonate with me. So yeah, to answer your question, I don't know how I was introduced to it, but here I am years later and we're talking about it.
So tell us why you chose to recommend this book to us.
Because I feel like everything that Eckhart talks about really encapsulates almost every question, challenge, issue, uncertainty that I've thought of or that I've had or that I felt. And it really makes it clear and defined. Just to kind of go back. So I've always been someone who seeks depth, right. Like you said in your last podcast, like yeah. I'm very much, I grew up in a very religious home, talking about prayer and your relationship with God and all that. So that's really been an integral part of my life. And so I've always had this almost existential crisis growing up. And I actually looked up, I kind of knew what that word meant, or yeah, 2 words meant. But I looked it up, and what I found was existential crisis, is an inner conflict characterized by the impression that life lacks meaning, confusion about one's personal identity in their definition. And I totally have felt that growing up. And I just couldn't put my finger on what this uneasy feeling was. The whole thing with religion, we could have another whole episode about religion, but the definition of religion to me growing up was it was almost very rigid, and I always found it difficult to connect to God. I was always looking outwards to find God and build a relationship with Him. And I always struggled with that growing up. So that was one thing. My everyday life, I just found, especially growing up over the years, I found it harder and harder to live with myself, which is really funny because the reason why Eckhart actually, where this whole book came from, was he was telling a story about when he was younger. He always had, he had depression and just a lot of internal turmoil that he was dealing with. And one night he had said to himself, he actually was on the verge of ending his life, and said to himself, I can no longer live with myself any longer. And that kind of, it made him stop in his tracks. And he said, well, wait, who is the I who can no longer live with myself? Are there 2 people? Are there 2 entities within me? So that's how he started kind of separating himself from the thought, or the thought of him thinking this, right? So I kind of got to a point where I was like, I can't live with myself anymore. I can't do this life anymore. But I didn't know where to take that.
Right.
And a part of that too is the purpose of life. I never knew how to answer that question. What is the point of life? Why do we have to be here? And what am I supposed to be doing? You're just so lost.
It's a loaded question.
A very loaded question. So that's why, I found this book very enlightening. And also my other thing too is triggers in my life. I've had situations where people really triggered me, and I felt like I reacted in a way that was like, out of line with what just happened. And even in my reactions and responses to the people who are closest to me, family members, my partner, and I just almost hated myself for the way that I was, showing up in the world. So those were all kind of reasons why I really like this book. And what Eckhart proposed. Well, it is truth, but it really answered a lot of those questions for me.
I think you really highlighted why, all the reasons behind why this book is so important to you. But I couldn't help but wanting to ask you, did you feel like you could see yourself in some of Eckhart's stories as he was telling them? Like you were the one that was living those moments?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think fundamentally as humans, we're all the same. And we can all identify with what he's talking about.
Right. Because
we're all human beings. We're both the physical human, and we're a being. There's something deeper within all of us that's present.
Yeah.
And so it applies to each and every person. So I think it really speaks to each person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What were your first impressions to me?
There's something before we go to that, Christine, that you referenced briefly that I want to kind of dive a little bit more into. And you talked about Eckhart's breaking point, right? And what led him there. But I want to hear a little bit before we dive into kind of these ideas that each of us took from the book that shifted our paradigms. What was your breaking point? And if you're open to sharing why that was such a pivotal moment in time and how you started moving from that point towards where you are today.
Yeah. So this is a little personal, but I am okay sharing it.
Yeah.
I think my breaking point was where my ego was really being tested. Who I am was really being tested. And that came to me after marriage, actually. A few things about marriage that were really difficult was this identification to another human being. I identified so much with being my husband's partner and a wife, with all these superficial roles and how I'm supposed to show up in the world, that I lost myself, my genuine self so much. And whenever there was a moment where I felt like I could lose that person, that really, it really threatened the concept of who I thought I was. And also my reactions when we did get into like an argument or a fight, and how I was so quick to respond in such a way that was, not healthy.
Yeah.
So I really didn't like who I was becoming because I was losing myself so much in the relationship.
Yeah, and I think that very nicely kind of takes us towards one of the first things that really stood out to me. And Eckhart talks extensively about this over the first 4 chapters, but this idea of ego and what it is, how it originates, where it comes from, and ultimately some of the downfalls that we as humans fall into when we are taken for a ride by ego. I would say for myself, that was really where the book kind of hit me in the gut. And I'll tell you why. I myself have always seen myself as the main character in a movie, in a video game, in an anime, for anybody who watches that. I've always seen myself as that. And that has its benefits. It allows me to be able to see adversity as something that is simply an obstacle that I need to overcome to get to the next destination. They're just battles that are going to give me experience so that I can grow more into who I'm meant to be and defeat whoever it is that I think needs to be defeated, for lack of a better term. But I really love how very quickly Eckhart started dismantling that paradigm very fast about how that ultimately leads us to see ourselves as other and all of the things that come with seeing ourselves as separate from each other. As I was going through it, I'm like, yeah, I can think of at least 3 stories where this part or this downfall. I'll give a specific example. When you see somebody acting in a way that you believe to be, let's say, non-virtuous, we had used this idea of virtuous versus non-virtuous in a previous episode. Let's go with that. It's very easy to just say, oh, the reason why they're doing this is because they are not a good person, or they don't share the same type of values as me, so therefore they are somebody I need to see as an enemy. That is extremely dangerous. And one of the things that Eckhart talks about is how we make enemies out of other people when that's the case. And I can't even begin to count the number of people that in one part of my life or another I viewed as an enemy or a threat or somebody who needed to be overcome in order for me to get to where I wanted to go. So that was a huge wake-up call for myself about the dangers around that. And so that was the first thing I would say really stuck out to me.
Yeah. Well, I think, like I said, the book was excellent. It's I didn't necessarily know exactly what I was getting into when I was reading this book. In life, I think that we always will encounter whatever it is that we need in that moment. And I truly believe that in this moment, I needed this book, because the biggest takeaway for me was that I don't question things enough. And when I'm talking about things, I'm really talking about everything in my life, the motivation for why I take action. I've quickly realized that I could have saved myself a lot of pain by truly understanding what I've described in the past as the demons in my own closet, and knowing that the person that is factual can be in control of that. What I found really interesting about the book itself is the way that it describes and it breaks down the difference between our internal world and how it interacts with our external world, and how that drives us to then interact with the external world. We've previously touched on intrapersonal relationships and what that looks like. But this book really breaks it down to the root level and how you need to be approaching life and what that looks like. And the title of it, of A New Earth, is about really building a new world. But the world is really ourselves, independently. And it's so funny because I've spent money with seeing counselors and therapists to better understand myself. But Tolle really talks about how the answers are already within us, but we're not looking in the right places. But I think something super valuable that you said, Christine, about the right timing, and I resonate with that a lot, is indeed things in life come at the right time, because that's exactly when you're ready to hear them. So
It's powerful.
it was an incredibly interesting book for sure. And so this kind of brings me down to ask you guys a couple of questions. And since we mentioned ego, let's talk about perhaps how individually ego has affected our lives. And I liked something that you said to me about how ego positively affected your life.
Mm-hmm.
And after reading this book, I still believe that although in some ways we could say that ego is the enemy, I also think that ego can be your ally.
I would definitely still agree with that, only because it's such an ingrained part of who I am at this point in my life. It is definitely something that I will work to mitigate in terms of some of the downsides I've seen, but inevitably the greatest triumphs that I've had in my life they've come as a result of me being able to leverage this to be able to overcome those things that were getting in my way. What about you, Christine?
So this is a really interesting way to start the talk about the ego. So what Eckhart proposes is that what the ego is, essentially, is a collection of thoughts and stories that have kind of accumulated in our heads over time through our past, through what we've been taught, through what we've learned, experienced, all these things. So it's putting words to life.
Yeah,
it's putting a narrative to life, but it's not life. And it's not truth. So, and what the ego does is it likes to narrate what is going on, and through our perception, and that it's merely our perception. And again, our perceptions come from how we were raised, how we were raised to think. But again, it's not truth. So, the ego does inform us of a lot of the reality is we live in this world, right? We go to work, we have tasks that need to be done. We are, in a way, avatars walking around on this planet, right?
Yeah.
So
true.
I think the ego does serve a purpose for sure. And as human beings, that is part of what it is to be a human being. That's what separates us from animals, is our thoughts. Animals don't walk around with stories in their heads about who they are, or they're very instinctual. They're very present and in the moment and act upon instinct and what needs to be done now. And they're so alive and present. Whereas we live so much in the head. And I think the danger of the ego is when we identify so closely with it that we lose touch of who we are as living presence, as life forces that are part of this thing called, part of this universe. So I think the ego does play a huge role, because the reality is that we are living in this world and we need to interact and do our jobs. But yeah, like I said, I think we need to be able to separate, when it comes down to it, separate the self from the ego, because if we don't, I think we run into many, many problems.
Yeah. One of the main things that really was highlighted for me, especially in the first, I believe, 2 chapters of this book, was how we actually begin to develop ego. And so I liked how Tolle talked about how a child first learns their name and they refer to themselves in the third person, Johnny Hungry, right? Because that is how he views himself, he is his name. Then, as children get a little bit older, they learn the word I and start referring to themselves in the first person. And so that's a bit of an expansion of ego. But then they learn mine and my. And the ego then starts to encompass the things that they perceive as being theirs. So let's say their favorite toy. That is why when a child misplaces their toy, or it's taken away, or it's broken, to them it's the worst possible thing that could have happened, because they see that as a loss of themselves. And I love how Tolle then went and expanded that. As we become adults, we start to identify with what our careers, the car we drive, the house that we live in, the neighborhood we're in. And we always say, my neighborhood, my car, my job. And that begins to encapsulate who we are and what we see ourselves as. And we start to use that to measure our value in this world. That to me was pure truth. It was like a mic drop right there, because I was just thinking about all the ways in which that idea has plagued me and has led me astray in certain ways.
I just want to touch on what you said, because ever since I stopped reading this book, I tried to stop using the words my, mine, I, to try to detach myself a little bit from this sense of identity that I've developed over the years. And Tolle, I copied this down from the book. He defines ego as identification in form, which is basically what you guys explained. And when I was attempting to do that, it was so hard to not identify with everything that defines me. And I really like how Christine sort of explained that as well. Because, and you've also touched on it, but we generate this identity, but when we become so attached to it that anything that threatens that identity, and you brought up the challenges that you face with how your identity changes when you get married, because that threatened the identity that you were so comfortable in living in, and then it then brought in changes that threaten that identity. And Tolle talks about how we react poorly to things that threaten that identity, that threaten that ego. And it's so interesting how all of us then continue to develop that very thing that was ingrained from us as kids in our home environments, from our family members, the people that we were involved in. You brought the notion about spirituality and what that looked like and how that made you rigid around certain beliefs. And that also speaks volumes into our inability and our rigidity about our own beliefs. And they don't have to be religious. They could just be beliefs, generally speaking, about perhaps the things that we eat, how we speak, how insightful we're trying to be, the way we behave around people. Tolle talks about role playing and the roles that we put up. He talks about people that go to work, the role you play as a parent, the role you might play, in other areas of your life. And it's so true.
Christine, would you say that you have seen a similar development in terms of of ego the way that Tolle has described it, or have you seen it play out any differently in your own life?
Oh, absolutely. And, just like he talked about the child with the toy, and the toy is his or hers and says, this is mine. I feel like we have the same attachments to people,
Absolutely.
and that's where my attachment to my partner came in. It was like, if I lost this, I might as well lose a limb, because it became so ingrained into my definition of self. And I think Eckhart goes beyond that, but also like an idea of who you are. So a lot of people pride themselves on being, the straightforward person, the I take no crap kind of person, or I'm a very kind person. It's an attachment to an idea, not just a thing, not just an object, but an idea. And like you said, jobs, some people pride themselves so much on their education or their careers that God forbid, if that's taken away from them, they're lost. They don't know who they are. Many people that I know, including myself, and I actually wanted to give a disclaimer before this, is that I'm nowhere near where, an enlightened state. I'm included in this too, but I don't know what I would do with myself if I didn't have a job to go to.
Yeah.
Who would I be? And so I think it is really an important, and Uriel, you said you tried not to use I or mine or, any of those words. And it is really hard, because I think this is something that takes a lot. It's like meditation or prayer. They're all the same thing. And it's essentially what it is living an unceasing life of prayer or meditation is kind of the goal that we're trying to get to. Yeah. And I think that is living. I think that's true, authentic living. Yeah. And that's essentially what he talks about, is living disconnected from the ego, or at least being aware of the ego and always remembering or feeling alive in who you are.
Yeah. Christine, you brought up something that I was really hoping was naturally going to come up, which is this idea of awareness. What I loved about what Tolle talks about in terms of awareness is that he says that ego and awareness cannot coexist, because the moment that you become aware of the fact that ego is in charge, that is the moment that you begin to disengage from that. And that to me was very helpful, because it helps me understand that while, this has been an ongoing problem and is going to be something I'm going to have to work through for quite some time to be able to overcome, I'm glad that I have at least started to recognize the way that it impedes me, the way that it does not serve my highest ideals. And it was reassuring to know that, again, we've talked in the past about how you got to find what's relevant to you, right? But I don't know if this would stand out, or if this stood out to you guys the same way, but that to me made me feel much better about the progress that I have been trying to make in this area. Because I like the analogy he uses, that the moment that you realize that something is an illusion, it loses all power. And that illusion of us being separate, of me feeling like, oh yeah, this is somebody that I need to overcome to get to where I want to go. Understanding that that is just ego, and that is just something that I, for one reason or another, have adopted that has served me in some type of way. Knowing that that is something that I can identify is an issue and allow that to start, or allow myself to start letting go of that, it was reassuring and kind of helped me understand that, there is hope for me.
That's great to hear. And when you were both talking, and we're talking about identity, we're talking about ego, I was just thinking, it's really interesting how we're identifying with things that we are saying. I mean, we've all read the same book, so obviously we're going to have similarities, but we're pinpointing points that we, all three of us, identify almost mutually and agree on. And when I had initially talked about my initial impression of the book is about asking why. The why as to why it is that I identify with things the way that I do. And when I was having a hard time not using those words with things that I own or are mine, that identify within me, that feed into that ego, I start to question and see what is actually feeding my ego. And it's about that awareness that you were talking about. And it's really funny because I took that entire quote from the book about when you said bringing awareness to the illusion basically destroys it. But the beginning, it says your reality becomes a reflection of the illusion, and recognizing the illusion destroys the illusion, which was the part that you mentioned. And it's so interesting because when you start to really look at and not wage war on the ego, but just be aware about how it very strategically wiggles its way into your life and navigates it and lives through you, that you start to be able to mitigate some of the damage that it can cause in your life.
Right.
The second thing that I identify with what you were saying about how Eckhart Tolle said about the ego. He says the ego can create illness in order to strengthen itself through them, which was really interesting. And you sort of touched on that a little bit. But when I relate that to my life, and I found whether it be in relationships or even just my own personal health, when I found in my past that perhaps my parents weren't giving me attention as a kid, you act ill. The ego is talking right there. And so then that becomes a learned behavior. And then the ego knows, hey, this is now how I can get, X, Y, and Z from certain people. And so then that relates back to that illusion that becomes in your reality. And you start to lose control of who it is that you are. So all of these things are super interesting, and we can sit here and talk about it and really break it down. But then it brings me back to, why do you guys think identity feels so important and necessary?
I think for myself, I think that the reason why I cling to that so hard is that it helps me generate a sense of significance in this world. For myself, I know that when I was growing up, I was made to feel like a lot of things that weren't necessarily my fault or responsibility were my fault and responsibility, such as the behavior of my siblings. Let's start with that. Because I'm the oldest, my family members, my parents would always say, the reason why your siblings are misbehaving is because you are misbehaving. And the moment that you stop doing that, they too will stop misbehaving, and we will be able to have more, let's say, peace in the house. And so, I internalized that for quite some time. And I told myself that that was the reason why things weren't the way that they were supposed to be, or that other people believe they should be at home. And the interesting thing with that is that as I started to shift my ways, my siblings' ways still stayed the same, right? Of course, they were quite a few years younger than me. And it comes back to what you were saying, Uriel. When you get your needs met in a specific way, you are going to continue doing whatever it was that got that need met, because it's worked in the past, and the best indicator of future outcomes is past outcomes, right? And so you learn to internalize that as a way to get your needs met. But I think that the tricky piece around that, for me anyways, and why I think identity and clinging to having a clear identity was so important to me, is that I wanted to disassociate myself from the constructs that other people, the mental constructs of myself that other people had, because I could see that they weren't serving me and they weren't in alignment with where I wanted to go. And so I have tried to live my life in such a way that it's very clear who it is that I am and what I believe, that anybody, even people who don't like me or who don't respect me, can at least say that they know what I'm about.
I think it's because we have lost touch with the source of life. Whether you want to call it God, whether you want to call it universe, whether you want to call it life, whatever it is. I think growing up, we were always taught that we are our behaviors. We are our actions. And so that's all we that's all we know growing up. I don't think we're like, this world is so busy, and there are so many people who are asleep, and live very superficial lives. And I think this whole concept of going back to being silent and knowing yourself is just something that we haven't been raised doing, or knowing how to do. And even through prayer growing up, prayer was always what I was taught anyways, was like, pray that God guides you, or pray that God does what's best for you, or ask for this, or, it was always to something else or someone else. It was never look within yourself and just be silent and hear the voice that is meant to be heard within you. And so I don't think we grew up knowing how to do that. And so, and if you ask anyone in our parents' generation, they would be like, what are you even talking about? Like, you are your name, you are this kind of person, yeah. you behave this way, but that's not who we are. We behave that way, or we show up in the world that way because of past circumstances. And so I think we feel the need to identify with something because we don't know any way else. That's all we know. That's the only way we know how to live and show up in this world. But that causes a lot of pain and suffering.
Absolutely.
Tons, because it's so fickle, right?
Yeah.
Because if anyone challenges who you think you are, it's like the ego takes over and you just lose yourself even more. And so we can't use that to, all these titles and ideas, we can't continue to identify so closely with them anymore, because we'll get lost in it if we don't have our bearings,
It's like they say, you get lost in the sauce.
Yeah.
More ways than one, right?
Yeah, seriously. But this whole idea of ego and identity, I think it comes down from our parents, and it's like almost like generational to generation. It's so ingrained into society. It's so ingrained into the fact that society is built, in my opinion, to develop egotistical people. We all have to play a role. And in order for us to play that role, you have to identify with that role. When you choose to receive education, you're choosing a role that you're going to play into a greater system. And in order for that system to function, those roles have to be put into place. But I really like the way that you continue to describe this relationship with identity and finding almost like a balance. I'm not overly familiar with Buddhism, but my understanding is that their beliefs, and I could be wrong, so I apologize if I am, but it's about balance, maintaining balance between everything. And finding that balance is one of the most challenging things. Another really interesting thing that I've been pondering a lot recently since I finished reading the book is how spirituality has sort of dictated also that path in my life, and how it also changes other people's perspectives in the way that they see the world. So spiritually, we believe that we're in this world and we have a purpose. But if you really think about it and relating it back to the book, we're identifying with that greater purpose, or we're at least trying to, on a spiritual level, to identify what that purpose might be so that we can serve that purpose in this world. That already in itself right there is developing that ego. And you could see it differently, right? in knowing that perhaps, as sort of you said, and Tolle really says it incredibly well, is he said, and I just copied little things down, but he notes that intelligence is hampered by the madness that we live in. And we are living in madness. There's so many expectations. I mean, you have to be a part of the system. You said it earlier, if you didn't have a job, if we didn't have jobs, we're not going to be living off on the street. You know, we still have to pay taxes. You have to aspire to have a roof over your head, to be able to feed yourself and to be able to live in this world. But there is dysfunction in the human condition, as he says it, because it's so generational that when you're born into this world, personally, I believe that although we may have skills that suit us better, we still have to make a conscious decision to interact with the world in a way that I believe we still kind of are forced to interact with, that we have absolutely no choice. How we interpret that interaction with the world. Again, questioning, why am I interacting with this world this way? And not allowing that to define your identity is that middle ground of what I believe is the balance. And again, this is so individual from one person to the other. And this is the beautiful thing about really sitting down with people and seeing their perspectives, because it opens up your eyes, just like this book opened up our eyes in different ways. So that's why he touches on our shift in consciousness, because we're human beings and our subconscious is always going, but we're not actually noticing the processes that are happening, right? And so that is why we react in different ways, or we react differently to situations based on our experiences, based on our background, based on our spirituality, our cultural preferences. And I mean, if you want to speak generally, I think that's why the world is having so many disagreements about a variety of topics. Because in some ways, people think they know what they are identifying with. But I'm of the belief that people actually don't actually know exactly what it is that they identify with.
So I think like it is a balance, like you said, but I don't know if it's a balance in a way that it's not like a 50-50 sort of thing. I don't see it like that. I see it as we are playing a role on this earth, but there has to be in the background a constant awareness that's always there. And I think that's the goal, is to not lose that awareness of who we are. Because sure, we can all identify with a million things, but what if we lost them tomorrow? Will we lose ourselves? And that is the question. It's not a question of whether or not these things, like these things are a part of my role that I play on this earth, the physical role. Sure. I mean, we all have to eat. We all have cars that, we need to drive to get to work, and homes and food and whatnot. But how tied to these things are we? And that's the question.
Deeply tied, I would say.
Yeah, right? And you're right, Uriel. It's so hard. I'm going to kind of, I don't know if you want to touch on this quite yet, but he talks about not labeling anything is a good start, and he says the easiest thing to do is go into nature. Take something that is not physically dense, like a rose petal or something, water, and just look at it for what it is, and do not label it, and do not put a story to it. And honestly, like, I was like, okay, cool. I'm going to try that. And I go out and I'm like, oh, there's a tree. Oh, there I go. But I just labeled it. Like, oh, that tree is really, really green, and I just labeled the whole thing. It's a really, really hard thing to do to something that's like not part of you, let alone to yourself. But this is ultimately, like I said, what meditation is, and the practice of it. And that monkey mind, they call it,
Yeah.
is just all over the place. So it really is hard to be present in your body. But then you could start applying that once you understand, like once you feel it, then you can apply it to your life in general.
Yeah. What this part of the conversation has reminded me of that also really spoke to me is what Tolle talks about in terms of suffering, and about how suffering is as a result of the way that we perceive things. Christine, you touched on this earlier when you said, what happens if we lose these things tomorrow, right? We lose our job. Well, for most people, a huge piece of your identity is going to go with that. When you meet somebody new for the first time, one of the first questions that comes up, what do you do for work, right? And people sometimes very proudly or maybe sheepishly, depending on the type of job you have and the societal prestige that comes with that. I think for us working in healthcare, we probably talk about that quite confidently, right? And I think we're used to having people say, oh, that's amazing. Like, I could never do that work. Like, really kudos to you. We really need people like you, right? And what does that do? Well, for myself anyways, it feeds the ego, right? Right. And I learned early on that, wow, this is actually something that I can use, right? But then that's where, for myself anyways, I started falling into that danger. And that's why what Tolle says about how that suffering comes when we use, or when we allow the ego to encapsulate all these different forms and all of these different things that we then put into this box of me. And that's the danger of that. And I've seen that in my life in so many different ways, where something happens that I believe is not in alignment with the vision that I have, or that is not the way that I foresaw things going. And what happens then? I have a bad attitude about that, which has this whole host of cascading effects. It affects the way that I see myself, which then affects the way that I see others. It affects the way that I treat others, and leads me to act in a suboptimal way that is not in alignment with who I want to be.
Brings up so many things to just think about. Personally, though, I just think about two things. One is, as you mentioned, Christine, about being objective about things and not trying to take as much subjectivity out of life as you can, which is incredibly hard, because I think as humans, by nature, we're emotional beings. We're driven by our emotions, and in many ways, keeping control of those emotions can be one of the most daunting things. There's tons of books that talk about your emotions. We've briefly touched on Stoicism and how that has been negatively perceived as people that are emotionless. So finding, again, that balance, I totally agree with you. It's not a 50-50. I actually think that it's always moving, and you have to add and remove from one side to the other to keep on balancing it. I don't necessarily think it's just a static thing. And I think we probably all believe that. You don't?
No.
I would love to hear about that in just a second. The reason why I believe that is, in my life, I found that nothing has been static. Relationships evolve. My relationships with my environment evolves. My development will always continue to hopefully evolve. But even after just reading this book, there are things that I believed that were driving me towards the place that I want or I desire to be in that no longer need to be there. And it's all about perspectives. But tell me, before we get too sidetracked from that, I want to hear your thoughts.
There are a couple things I want to say. Well, I'll answer.
Yeah.
I'll answer your question first, Uriel. I don't think it's 50-50. I think, like I said before, although things around us change constantly, we never change. Who we are just us.
Okay.
And that has nothing to do with what we put as important or not important in any given time of our lives. That is a thought process.
Mm-hmm.
That's not who we are.
Okay.
I think the less grounded and the less we are aware of who we are as life forces
Mm-hmm.
and the authentic self,
Mm-hmm.
our brains are always going to be shifting. That doesn't mean that we change. We never change. I think the roles that we play will change.
Right.
I think the thoughts that go through our heads will change. How we perceive things will change, but who we are fundamentally will never change. So,
what makes you say that?
Because I think that we are essentially the same thing, which is energy.
Okay. Yeah.
We are energy beings. And I don't know if you want to call it the soul, but we are a soul. But I think the way that it is created is the way it will always be. I think that is something that nothing will ever change. I think our minds are so influenced by what's going on around us that we think we change. But I don't think we do. I think over time we can become a lot more alive, awakened. And awakened, I know it's such a buzzword, but awakened literally means like I'm awake. As long as we're in our minds, in our heads, we are not awake.
It's like you're actually living.
You don't feel life.
Yeah.
Because we're like robots and zombies walking around being controlled by our brains, which is controlled by everything else around us. I think we have to live as alive beings, separate from what happens around us, separate from even what happens to us, you know? So yeah, that's kind of what I think about that.
What do you think, Timmy?
When I hear this idea of, let's start with balance, right? The way that you were talking about it, I would say that I do agree that it is more of an ebb and flow depending on what's going on in life. And that in certain times of your life, you need to, let's say, spend more of your energy or more of your focus needs to go in a certain direction. But I think the other piece of this is the awareness, right? Which is what we've been talking about being the linchpin when it comes to overcoming ego. I think that being aware of the fact that we have these tendencies within us, it allows us to be able to guard against them in a way that allows us to improve in an iterative way. And what I mean by that is this. Let's say that you act in a way that's suboptimal or not in accordance with your highest ideals. And when you take the time to evaluate that experience, that's where the awareness comes in. That's where the learning becomes possible. I think that it's important to take that time to do that. But I think even more important than that, we need to seek out opportunities to then apply that as quickly as possible so that we can internalize it in a more robust way. For myself, I have a lot of ideas that I'm like, this could be very helpful to me if I actually applied this. But it's not until you actually put it into practice and see the outcomes that are associated with that we're really able to understand what that's actually about. And I think that one of the big things that for myself will be really relevant going forward as I seek to find different ways to incorporate the ideas of this book into my own life is that idea of perception that we were talking about earlier, because the stories, Christine, that you referenced earlier, that we make into, or that we bake into our identity of who we are and what it is that we're here for and what our purpose is. I think that is where we start to get sidetracked and we end up in a situation like you talked about, Uriel, where society as a whole is suffering from a lack of, I don't want to say maybe lack of purpose, but let's go with that, right? A lack of purpose in general, I would say, is quite pervasive in this life now, where people feel like they don't have that direction. I think that part of it is that we have moved away from having religion be a central part of what people believe to be truth. We're really starting to get away from that. But for centuries, I would say even millennia, that was the guiding North Star. Whereas now people are able to pursue truth in many other ways. And I think there's implications that are positive and negative. But what I will say is that whichever way you want to pursue what you believe to be truth. I think that the critical thing that Eckhart really talked about is just having that awareness. And that awareness comes from, as you said, Christine, taking that time to look within, whether it's prayer, meditation, journaling, having conversations like this, right? I think that it's critical to be strategic in providing yourself with opportunities for that.
Yeah. Sorry, I just want to mention one really important word that comes up a lot in Eckhart's book is presence. Not just awareness, but presence. So what he talks about is doing everything while you are present. So even if, like, say work is really busy and, you know, the whole ebb and flow and something is taking a lot of energy from you, doing it with presence is the most important thing. And that's part of the awakening, is not just doing things mindlessly, because then you're going to actually run into a lot of errors, because you're doing things based off of your ego. A lot of things that we say, that we do, how we react or respond is coming from a place of unawareness and not being present in that moment. He talks a lot about, like, when you show up, even in any sort of interaction with anybody, the biggest thing you can do is to show up present. How many times have we completed a task or done a job or had a conversation even with someone when we're not present and our minds are elsewhere, you know? And how easy is it to harm or mess up or make an error when we're not really present in that moment? And I think that's the most important thing. It's not just like not doing anything, not doing your job and doing it well, not showing up for others, not living in this world, but it's doing it with full, deliberate, like you're deliberately doing something, like you're thank you. You're intentionally doing it, not just doing it out of habit.
Right.
And that's what I found, actually. To me, we had this conversation not too long ago about, like, you know, you brought up suffering a lot. And part of my suffering actually was just my day-to-day living. You know, I was so unalive in my life that I almost dreaded living in my life.
Yeah.
Nothing had meaning to it. And everything, like getting up, doing the laundry, taking the dog out, going to the gym, everything was like pulling teeth. It was like, because I was just in my head all the time. But when I actually was doing something and I was in my body and I was actually present for it, and I never thought about the next task, I just thought about, this is the only moment, is now. I actually learned to enjoy life, and it made life so much more bearable. And I think that was actually one of the biggest things that came out of this book for me, was living in the present moment. And not, because we are missing our lives constantly when we're in our heads and thinking about the next thing that we have to do. We're missing out on life. We're not living it.
Yeah. And he touches a little bit on, like, being obsessed with thought and the ideas of things. And we keep kind of coming back to providing meaning to life. And as I was thinking about it and you guys were talking, all I could think about also how that obsession to the thought that our lives have to have meaning. And it sounds crazy to say it out loud when I'm saying, like, why should my life have meaning? And we look for almost this godlike meaning, I feel, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, that it should always have. I mean, there's a lot of things that contribute for our desire to have a life where perhaps we're adored, we're looked up to, or we're seen as a figure of influence. And I just want to bring it back down to the very basics, which he says to find the good in you and to let it emerge. And that's the part where I'll agree with you, where I think that we are static in that, because I think that individually we all have like some really amazing qualities as humans, just as a whole, as beings of this universe. I think fundamentally, as humans, you see another person hurt, like naturally, you want to go and help. You want to give them a hand. You want to care for them. I think it's very rare that we don't have static attributes that don't want us to actually help one another. And I will agree with those. I also agree with the premise that you mentioned in regards to the brain and how that's ever changing. I agree with that. And that's the biggest challenge. A little bit that I add about what I'm thinking is just that we always have to change, at least for me, what we need to do in that balance so that we can get back to being ourselves, which is that static being that we should be, that brings us back to the moment and living and being in our bodies and presence. Yet, providing presence to our life and being mindful about our interactions and what that looks like. Because if we are to allow the goodness within us that really provide meaning to our lives, we have to be present in sort of almost, I see ego as this person that needs love. This other internal me that needs a hug, that needs to tell them that they're good enough, that needs to tell them that I love them and I accept them for what they are, and they don't have to continue to strive to be something that they're not. And I think that that's where that like good in me comes out. That's where like that true, like that I think all of us, honestly, I do genuinely believe that all of us have. But we, as we said it before, we just get so lost and obsessed with these thoughts of what we should be, what's expected of us, and how inferior we are if we don't choose to seek that glorification that is superficial human life. And it's crazy because you can't even have conversations like the one that we're currently having with people anymore.
To that point right there, that's really highlights what it is that we've strived to do by creating this space, right? Is to have an opportunity to explore honestly and authentically without that fear of judgment, right? And I think that even in this conversation here, that each of us have shed pieces of ego, right? We've talked openly about why this was important for us, right? And why this recommendation that Christine, thank you. This has been great, because not only have we had this opportunity to really cement and hash out why it is that this was of significance to us, but why it is that we're definitely going to have more conversations about this, right? I think we kind of already knew going into it that there's a lot to it, right? And so I guess to bring part one to a close, a question I want to ask you guys is, in this next week, what is something that you're going to seek to apply in terms of ego, let's say ego, identity, or suffering within those three categories? What is something that you're going to seek to apply or to do differently or to have more intentionality around? And why is that something that you think would be of value to you?
Wow. That's it's a loaded question for sure. I mean, I feel like all the questions have been loaded. So many things I wish I could do differently. I don't know that I'll always get it right. I don't think I'll ever get it right, which is, I think, what excites me about life in general. I believe that I'm somebody, not because of my ego or what I identify with. I get bored when I'm not being challenged. I like solving complex challenges and looking deep into things to my detriment a lot of the time. It's not egotistical of me to want to desire to know more. It's more so I want to be more in tune spiritually with myself. I believe in God, but I wouldn't necessarily say that I identify with any religion. I've had the pleasure of having the experience to experience different religions out of curiosity. Other times it's been not out of choice when I was younger. And I've been able to experience how those people interact with the world as a result of that. And I just want to really highlight how those experiences also changed how I was interacting with the world, because I held those same beliefs. And to some degree, I also think, and I know for myself and the way that I perceived it, is that people become obsessed with that. And bringing it back to what you asked about me and what I'm going to choose to do for hopefully longer than, the next week. But it's to stop becoming so obsessed with my thoughts and my idea of the world that I should be living in. And I want to just kind of add 2 takeaways that I've learned from you guys. Let's talk about really what you've been hammering down on us, and it's about that awareness and really truly being aware of what is important. Not my feelings, not being right in arguments, not feeling like I'm superior or inferior to other people. And secondly, to tie those 2 together is what you said, Christine, that I think really resonates with me, is about allowing that static thing to really come out and to be present at all times. But the only way that I can allow for that to happen is by being aware and not being obsessed with my thoughts and ideas of how the world should be.
Yeah. Mine would probably be similar to yours, Uriel, is letting go of whether something is good or bad, or should or shouldn't have happened this week. And just always reminding myself that it is, and actually recently my favorite quote for life has been, "It is what it is."
Yeah.
I took that with me in Mexico for the 2 weeks that we were just there. A lot of things didn't go our way. And what kept me really out of this anger spiral is this mantra of it is what it is. And it's neither good nor bad. It just is.
It just is. I knew that that's what you were going to say. Yeah, for myself, it's going to be stillness, because I think that my mind, it moves far more quickly than is probably good, I would say, especially when something that I find to be unexpected or unpleasant happens. And immediately I start jumping to conclusions about why this is not how it should be and what I'm going to do to make it the way that I believe it should be. And I think that the awareness piece is key, which is why I've kept bringing it up. But Christine, you're really spot on that presence is what is required to create the space for that awareness. If we're so in our heads all the time, there's no possible way that you're going to have a moment to be still enough to understand what's going on. So that's the biggest one for me. And so it's been a dope conversation so far. This is what I expected, and it's been nice to kind of explore this with you guys. And Christine, thank you for joining us today. It's been on point, to say the very least.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a really fun conversation, and you guys know me very well, and you know that I love to have these conversations, and we could probably have a conversation for 3 days straight without taking a break. So
Exactly, right?
Tons to talk about.
Yeah, so yeah, we'll be asking you to come back so we can continue this soon and very soon, because there's just so much more that Tolle talks about. So
Absolutely.
Well, I'm excited.
Stay tuned.
Absolutely. Thanks everyone for listening. We appreciate your continued support.
Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.